sound familiar? That is the opening of the melody of Bolero by Maurice Ravel. How does this melody sustain your interest despite the fact that it is repeated over and over and over again for 15 minutes straight? In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a sustained musical continuity that keeps your listeners riveted. My name is Samuel Andreyev. I'm a composer and I also teach composition. So it's not particularly hard to write a melody that's a few notes long or even 1 or 2 bars long, but it is very difficult to sustain a musical continuity across 4 bars, 8 bars, 16 bars, and beyond. But the good news is this is something that you can absolutely learn how to do. And as an example, I'm going to use the famous melody from Bolero. So let's get into it. There's 2 aspects to this melody that are really remarkable. The first is the length, 16 bars. That is a long phrase, and it's continuous, and it doesn't repeat. The second is it's squeezed into this narrow space of just a major ninth. The entire melody spans a D and the C, the middle C, a ninth below it. That's not much. So the further challenge with this piece is that the melody is heard over and over and over again without any modification except for the orchestration. So for that to work musically, for us not to be completely bored out of our minds by the 15th repetition of this melody, it's got to be bulletproof. It's got to be, something that can sustain that amount of repetition. So how does he do it? How does he work within these multiple constraints? Well, what I'm going to show is that there are actually 2 structural levels to this melody, and that will help us to understand it. So the first is that we can distinguish between tones that are structural tones, let's say, or tones that are like markers on a path. Okay, so these are the points towards which our ear gravitates for a while, and then he moves on to another one. And in between those markers, those structural tones or those principal tones in the melody, we have a kind of a second order material, which is sort of like filigree or passing tones, right? So the purpose of those tones is really to allow us to get from point A to point B in an interesting way. So let's look at how this actually works in the piece. Speaking of long-range musical continuity, that's exactly what I explore in my new album, In Glow of Like Seclusion. It's a beautifully produced double LP recorded at Swiss Radio Zurich by one of the world's premier classical sound engineers and performed by a top contemporary music ensemble with whom I've collaborated for years. You'll hear 4 of my compositions in authoritative performances pressed on 180-gram vinyl. I'm offering it exclusively to my YouTube audience for €35 plus international shipping, and I'll even sign your copy. To order, send me an email at samuel.andreyev@gmail.com. You'll notice that at the beginning, we start on the high C, and this note is actually repeated a fair bit at the beginning. So a lot of C's there, and you'll notice also that most of what's happening is we're setting up that tone as a marker, and all the other tones sort of turn around it. They're essentially ornamentations. He does that for a while, and then there's a little transition, and we end up on this G, a 4th lower. And then likewise, the G is also repeated multiple times. And then a little downward motion. This whole phrase takes us from the top C to the C 1 octave below it in 3 steps. C, G, C. You can sort of imagine this as like a leaf falling from a tree. It's sort of moving around in curlicues and various little erratic shapes, but the overall trajectory is very straightforward. It's a downwards trajectory. So you can have little byways, little twists and turns, provided that there's an overarching sense of direction in the line. Now that that process has completed, we've almost exhausted already the available range for this melody. Remember I said we had a major ninth from C to D. So where does he go from there? How do you keep this phrase going? What comes next? Well, you need some little hint of novelty in order to sustain the listener's attention at this point. Because if we were to start the next phrase again on C, even if the next phrase were a little bit different, and even if it were a really beautiful phrase, it probably isn't going to do the trick. We need something a little bit different. And what he does is very simple. He just moves it up a notch. So he starts on the D, a whole tone above the initial C. And that does a couple of things. The first is that it kind of implies a dominant function. So it even though the entire piece is on a tonic pedal, in other words, we never depart from having a C in the bass, right, that just goes on throughout the entire piece. Despite that, the D implies that we're moving harmonically, even though in reality the bass line stays the same the whole time. So that provides a semblance of movement. It also expands the range slightly. And when you're working in such limited confines, expanding the range by even a tone higher makes all the difference. Let's look at what happens next. There it's a similar kind of motion. We move from the D down to the F. You notice how both the D and especially the F are repeated a lot. And then we end up on the D, an octave lower than the starting note of the phrase. And there again, the D is repeated a whole bunch of times. And then you notice that little tumbling movement at the end as we alight on the final note of the melody, which is also the lowest tone of the whole piece. So squeezed into that narrow space is a movement, right? So we start here, move down to G, move down to C. There's a complete phrase. Then he has to expand a little bit. He moves up to the D, F, D, G, C. So this whole melody is hung on a very simple little skeleton that has a sense of movement, and it's a downward movement, right? He goes down an octave, C to C, expands it slightly, starts from higher, and then a final cadence at the end. So if you want to do this yourself, one of the things you want to do at an early stage of the process when you're writing your melody, especially if you're starting out, is define little arrival points before you even start writing the line. And you can say, for example, in bar 1, we're going to start with a C, then it's going to move up to an A, and then once we've got to the A, we'll move up a fourth to the D, then it'll go down to B, G, and then C at the end, or something like that. You can make up your own trajectory. And of course, this can be as complex or as simple as you want to make it. Of course, it can be diatonic, it can be chromatic, it can be modal, whatever you want. In a sense, it doesn't matter. But if you're going to write a really long line, and you want to make sure that our ear is oriented and that the line has a shape, that's something you have to bear in mind. So I would say that there are 3 kind of essential melodic archetypes that you can work with. In the case of Bolero, we're basically dealing with a descending line. It descends, it starts again a little bit higher and descends again. But you can do, of course, the opposite. You can have ascending lines, and you can also have lines that move in a kind of wave-like shape, right? And the crests and the dips in the wave can increase in amplitude as the piece progresses. You can start, focusing on a single note and expand it outwards and outwards and outwards so that the wave continuously increases. But whatever you do, try to see what you can come up with working with this simple approach. And let me know in the comments below if this has been helpful. Thanks for watching. And as a reminder, I do offer composition lessons on Zoom. If you're interested, you can get in touch in the same email address that I provided for the LP. Thanks for watching.